We have breaking news now. President Trump has notified Congress that he's removing the Inspector General for the intelligence community, Michael Atkinson, who flagged the Ukraine whistleblower complaint. The firing will take effect 30 days from today, according to a letter obtained by NBC News. Joining us now by phone is NBC News correspondent Ken Dilanian. Ken, tell us what this is about.
Ali, this looks like the latest in a series of measures that President Trump has taken against anyone that acted against his interest in the impeachment inquiry. This Inspector General of the intelligence community, if you'll recall, was the person who received that complaint from the anonymous whistleblower, but then he wasn't allowed to hand it over to Congress. The Director of National Intelligence and his lawyer stopped him from doing that. And this Inspector General, Michael Atkinson is his name. He's a career Justice Department prosecutor. He scrupulously followed the rules, and he notified Congress that he had this complaint, but he didn't tell them what was in it until he got legal clearance to do so. Ultimately, it was released and made public, and the rest is history. It resulted in the impeachment of a president. But Atkinson didn't take a side. Essentially, he received this complaint. He decided that it was an urgent concern and an important thing that Congress should have, and then he acted under the guidance of his lawyers. It's hard to imagine what he did wrong here, but the president is saying in a letter to the heads of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees tonight that he has lost confidence in Inspector General Michael Atkinson, and that he is using his power as president to remove him from office, and that removal will take effect in 30 days. And Democrats are just furious about it. There's statements from Adam Schiff, Mark Warner, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, just absolutely apoplectic about this move, Ali.
So this may well be retribution, and it may well be that Michael Atkinson did nothing wrong. However, this is a position that serves at the pleasure of the president, so the president can do this.
That's right, under the law. And the inspector generals are designed to be somewhat independent. They are confirmed by the Senate. This one actually was appointed by Donald Trump in 2018. So we can expect, I think, some blowback, not just from Democrats, but perhaps even Republicans. One complicating factor, though, is that the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Richard Burr, is under fire right now, is under investigation, actually, for having dumped all that stock after he got classified briefings on the pandemic. So he's essentially a wounded animal. And otherwise, he would normally be seen as somebody who would fight this and who would stand up to President Trump, potentially, because he believes in the integrity of the intelligence community and of these independent positions. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump does have the legal right to do this, Ali.
What, other than the fact that Michael Atkinson brought this to the attention of Congress, which is what he was supposed to do, is there any basis that Donald Trump can have for saying that there was wrongdoing? He doesn't have to get rid of him, but what does he believe that Michael Atkinson did wrong except raise this?
He is not saying. He's just simply saying that he has lost confidence in Michael Atkinson. He's not making an allegation of wrongdoing, and I'm not aware of any evidence of any wrongdoing by Michael Atkinson. One can intuit, however, that the president was not happy that Atkinson alerted Adam Schiff, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, about this classified complaint. He didn't tell him what was in it, but he said there was an important complaint that was being withheld. And by doing that, he set in motion the chain of events that ultimately led the complaint to become public and led to the impeachment of Donald Trump. And it's fairly clear that Donald Trump's not happy about that. But as to allegations of wrongdoing, there just aren't any, Ali.